On behalf of the members and friends of First Church of Christ Scientist, South Lake Tahoe, and our friends at First Church, Mill Valley, California, we'd like to welcome you to this second spiritual summit, a smorgasbord of healing solutions to life's challenges. We have three world-class speakers with us here today, and they will share their ideas and thoughts to help us along that path. In order to minimize repetition, I'm going to remind you of two very important books. This is a Ferrari. This won't do a thing unless you have something to start it with. This is Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, the key to the Ferrari, to help you unlock thought out of the Bible. So these are available to you. Anybody who doesn't have a copy of Science and Health or the Bible, there's free ones on our entryway table. And we also, if we run out of those, we'll take your name and address and make sure you get one in the mail. So if you'd like one, it's yours. Again, remind everybody, no recording, audio, video recording, no food in here. We'll have a 10-minute break after each talk. And then at the end of the talk, for the people in-house, there will be a question and answer session for those who would like to stay for that. And after that, the lecturers have agreed to be available for you to chat with. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Tony Lobl. Tony is a practitioner and the Committee on Publication in the United Kingdom. I think is all of the United Kingdom?
That will do.
It's a big area. The sun never sets, right?
United Kingdom and Ireland, actually.
And Ireland.
Yeah.
Forgot Ireland. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Tony Lobl.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I've been trying to practice how to say Lake Tahoe for a few days now. I didn't say it correctly first time, but fortunately my wife used to live in San Francisco, so she knew how to pronounce it. So I hope that was acceptable. So what I want to do is, just by starting with a little event that happened 150 years ago, something happened that was, on the surface, very unremarkable. A woman got out of bed, she got dressed, and she went into the next room. The thing that was very remarkable, though, about the fact that she did that was in the next room there were a whole bunch of people sitting there expecting that she would die. But she hadn't. And the other very remarkable thing about it was what it was that got her up out of that bed. She had a lovely relationship with the Bible. She loved the Bible, and particularly the words and works of Jesus. And she had read one of Jesus' healings that she was very familiar with, and she caught a glimpse of something new about spiritual reality. And she attributed that glimpse to the fact that she was able to get out of that bed, dress, and go into the next room. So it was an understanding of how God heals that came to her, but it didn't come to her in a vacuum. She had been reaching for that understanding for 2 decades before, both by reading the scriptures which she loved, but also by exploring allopathy, homeopathy, and alternative medicines apart from those, trying to find this answer, which she said she glimpsed in that moment of that healing. And it was an understanding that she was going to apprehend even more deeply following that moment of healing. She spent several months digging even deeper until she found an even more concrete understanding of what it was she had glimpsed that day. And it was an understanding that proved the practicality of the ideas in the Bible. So why the Bible? Some people might ask. Isn't it a book of dogmas and human beliefs in rules and regulations that have to govern us, perhaps against our will? Or maybe it's a book of myths, even fairy tales. Well, there are other ways to look at the Bible, other ways to think about the Bible. And one of the ways you can think about it is as a book that has brought comfort to people for many years. A constant source of comfort. Well, one of the quotes that refers to this, in the book of John, Jesus is quoted as saying, "I will not leave you comfortless. I will come unto you. I will not leave you comfortless." Now, many Christians sincerely interpret these words as meaning that the personal Jesus will return sometime in the future. But what if the comfort being promised is a bit more comforting than a future promise? What if it's referring to the comfort that everyone who was healed by Jesus felt in his love for them as they were being healed? And what if it was that comforting, healing love was not going to go anywhere when Jesus left, but would still be as accessible and available as when he was here, but perhaps just needed to be understood again as he himself had understood it? Well, this is how Jesus described the Comforter. This is how Jesus described the Comforter. The Comforter, which is the Holy Ghost, whom the Father will send in my name, he shall teach you all things, and bring all things to your remembrance whatsoever I have said unto you. And that understanding brings us beyond comfort to this Comforter. And there are many of us today, like me, who would say that that is exactly what Christian Science has done for us. It has brought to remembrance not only what Jesus said, which is very accessible in the Bible, but the understanding of what he did and what that can mean to us today. And it's something that was always in the Scriptures. It's not something new that was created separate to the Scriptures, but it was something that perhaps needed to be discovered within their pages. And I like the way a friend of mine called Thomas put it. He said, some people just see a box with black and white keys where other people see music. Beethoven was one of these people. He saw music in that box. And where others just saw a book with black and white pages full of commandments and dogmas, one person saw a divine science. That person was Mary Baker Eddy. Now, the science that Thomas is referring to is a science with a capital S. It means a systematic understanding of God as a loving father-mother, not as a moody, judgmental personality. And it is divine science precisely because it is the understanding of God, a God whose perfect goodness was best evidenced in the words and the works and the whole life of Jesus. And it's a divine science precisely because it pinpoints that there is an underlying truth, an underlying reality, that we're each the perfect outcome of a perfect spiritual source. And that's what Mary Baker Eddy concluded and articulated as a result of the research that she did both preceding that 1866 healing and following on from it, as we said earlier. She felt she had discovered the understanding of how Jesus and his earliest followers were able to heal not only the sick, but those who were struggling with the kind of character traits and other issues that the Bible would describe as sin. So that wonderful discovery that was made in the pages of the Bible by that lady, Mary Baker Eddy, has changed many lives for the better since then. But the first life that it transformed was hers. It changed her from being a seeker in need of healing to being a healer available to heal those in need. And she proved the practicality of her ideas not only by her public healing practice, which was remarkably successful, but also by teaching other people that they too could heal if they understood the divine science that was found in the pages of the Bible. And she also went on to found a publishing society that's still going strong today, and a newspaper, a Pulitzer Prize winning newspaper. And all that at a time when women were not even welcome in the workplace, which was an extraordinary thing to do at that time. And last but not least, she had great respect for many of the Christian ministers she met in her life at that time. She had a great love for real, wholehearted, primitive Christianity, alive with love. But what she found was that as she tried sharing these ideas, the denominations of her day did not pick up on them. And so finally she found herself having to be the founder of a church, which is really quite extraordinary if you think we're only now looking at women getting proper roles in spiritual leadership in society. And yet this was well over 100 years ago. So as you can imagine, that certainly challenged the status quo of her day. And yet above all, it was the radical nature of her spiritual ideas which challenged everything and caused a great stir. This is how an author called Jacob Neusner put it in a book called World Religions of America. And as I read what he had to say, I'm going to take out the word America. We've got a World Wide Web audience there, and I'm going to replace it with words that are global. So he said, what Mary Baker Eddy did was directly and emphatically challenge the status quo of global culture. In both her religious teachings and in their practical application, she called into question the authority of two of the world's most venerable institutions, religion and medicine. In matters of religion, she challenged both male dominance and the social power of male-dominated religions. In matters of medicine, she challenged the belief that medical institutions hold a monopoly on healing. And more fundamentally, Eddy challenged one of the most primary presuppositions of the modern secular West, the material basis of reality. So very briefly today, we're going to have a look at three of those points. But I think it's important to note that Mrs. Eddy was not challenging the institutions per se, as it perhaps seems from that particular rendition. She always remained deeply respectful of people with differing views. But her ideas did challenge the material emphasis in not just two, but three significant realms of male intellectual dominance of her day: science, theology, and medicine. She was in effect saying, look guys, you've got it all upside down. Science, theology, and medicine are actually spiritual disciplines designed to change our materialistic thinking and reform our experience by doing so. So during this time, I'm going to look at what I call three freedoms, which are in Neusner's bullet points. Overcoming obstacles, we'll have a quick look at how Eddy herself overcame obstacles. Healing from physical and mental illness, we'll look at a couple of examples of how that is still going on today. And then last but not least, freedom from belief in the material basis of reality, which is the underlying freedom that her discovery was actually all about. So who was Mary Baker Eddy? In a nutshell, she was a New England woman who became the discoverer and founder of Christian Science, and then became the leader of the worldwide Christian Science movement. The first half of her 90 years included many hardships, poor health, early widowhood, a second husband's infidelity, and so on and so on. Yet she never gave up searching for a spiritual solution and spiritual answers until she came to that understanding we mentioned, where she shared God's laws of comfort and healing, as taught and proved by Jesus. And it is this aspect of her theology which I think is so wonderful. It came out of a life lived in the furnace we're all living in. She proved and tested every single word you will find in this book, Science and Health. None of it is theoretical. Well, in my travels around the world, I've really been moved to see how her ideas just resonate with such a diversity of people across the board, including women from all races and all social strata. And I think they do so precisely because her writings empathize with the kind of tough lives and experiences that many of us have. and yet they go on to offer the comfort of practical solutions to all of those problems. Now, her second 45 years was by no means free of adversity, but the challenges she faced were rather different in the most part, as her vocal views on the limitations of materialism met fierce resistance, and as she became an ever more public figure in the public eye. But the transition between those two halves of her life, if you want to put it that way, was not in public. It was a very, very private moment. Like the Bible story of Moses, where Moses at the burning bush just suddenly saw with clarity that God is the great I am. So that insight Mary Baker Eddy had came out of a moment absolutely alone with God. And the idea that lifted her out of her deathbed situation and reoriented her from being a sincere seeker to being the leader of a global movement was a pure spiritual insight. She said, that short experience included a glimpse of the great fact that I have since tried to make plain to others, namely life in and of spirit, that life being the sole reality of existence. Spirit, she saw, was the sole reality of our existence. And in other words, matter is not king. What Eddy had glimpsed was that even at its best, matter is just a distorted view of a beautiful underlying spiritual reality, a reality that's all good, all harmonious, always. And indeed, she and others to whom she taught her system of healing increasingly backed up this scientific explanation of life with an increasing body of evidences of people who were cured of physical and mental difficulties through the healing ideas she had discovered in the Bible. And yet, if her discovery of the causation of all things being the divine mind or divine spirit was counterintuitive to the human belief of material cause and material effect, it was nevertheless exactly the thing that enabled her to meet all the resistance that came her way, opposing the progress of her ideas. So, as a friend of mine called Karen put it, she faced intense public ridicule for her advanced ideals. And that took form in many ways, including harassment through the law courts, all of the cases of which she won, and even a bomb threat, which fortunately was resolved without harm to anybody. And each new victory that she proved over adversity was a show of strength, but it was a show of the spiritual strength of her ideas. It wasn't based on personal charisma or human willpower. And I think in this day and age, it's really wonderful to have that example of what true leadership actually consists of. Eddy constantly pointed people away from putting any trust in a personality or a person. And instead she pointed them to the inherent inability each of them had to directly seek their solutions in prayer to God and seek divine guidance. And while she was never ever modest about what Christian Science could do, both when she was alive and in the generations to follow, she was modest about her own personality. She made this lovely statement. She said, "All I have ever accomplished has been done by getting Mary out of the way and letting God be reflected." All I have ever accomplished has been done by getting Mary out of the way and letting God be reflected. And indeed, you know, we could each put our own name into a similar sentence instead of Mary Baker Eddy's, and we would get a wonderful blueprint of how to rise above our own challenges. All I will ever accomplish will be done by getting whoever we are out of the way and letting God be reflected. Now, this is a truly practical approach to spirituality. And it's not about relinquishing our own individuality, but rather it's about unveiling the fact that beneath the seeming surface of things we are each infinitely more than we appear to be. Every one of us is a unique and complete reflection of divine love, God. And when we know that, and when we let go of whatever would seem to stop us from expressing that and experiencing that, it is empowering. And it is not only empowering, but it also echoes the lives of both the prophets and the apostles in the Bible, because their extraordinary lives transformed lives and healed minds and bodies. This is how a friend of mine called Lisa once put it. She said, Mary Baker Eddy resurrected the practice of Christian healing and made it accessible to the whole of humanity. So, let's have a quick look at what that resurrected practice of Christian Science can actually accomplish. These quotes I got from my friends, by the way, was I asked them on social media to share ideas of why they love both the discoverer, Mary Baker Eddy, and the discovery, Christian Science. And I got a whole slew of wonderful comments, and I've just picked out a handful. So here are three more. One friend said, Christian Science treatment healed me completely of heart failure 7 years ago. Another told me, because of Mary Baker Eddy's discovery, I was healed of liver disease. And still another added, whether through illness or accident, Christian Science treatment has effectively saved my life on more than one occasion. And of equal importance, she continues, divine love has become nearer, dearer, and more real to me. And for this, I am eternally grateful. Now, this last point is what you might call the side effects of Christian Science healing. That is, the spiritual lessons gained from experiencing it. But in fact, it's actually the other way round. Those spiritual glimpses are the very medicine of divine mind. They are the things which bring us our healing. And the practical change occurs as human beliefs that are the cause of the problems we're facing give way to the spiritual ideas of God that effectively correct and remove those beliefs. So I'd like to illustrate how that works in very practical ways now by sharing a couple of healings with you. One is a healing of severe depression, and the other one is a healing of pneumonia. And I'm going to start with a healing of depression. And if someone is suffering from severe depression, that can feel like the darkness within is just incredibly dense, even impenetrable. And yet the starting point in Christian Science is really, and the starting point in all science in a way, is that darkness is really the absence of light. And in Christian Science, that perspective is true for physical difficulties as well as for mental health difficulties. So any condition is not so much seen as a physiological condition, but at base it is understood to be a lost sense of the light of God that we inherently each do reflect. So depression, as much as any other illness, is one egregious part of this larger misconception that we are material rather than spiritual. Well, ultimately, it's a bit like the sense of a dark cloud covering the sun. So from below we see a lot of darkness, but actually nothing is having any impact on the sun. It's shining as happily as ever, and nothing can ever extinguish the sun. So it's a question of how we remove that seeming darkness within us. And that's exactly what came to mind when I interviewed Patricia about her depression, because she summarized her healing in this way. She said, it was the recognition of a familiar innocence that blazed through the material sense of darkness to open my troubled heart to the light already within. So that's a summary of the healing I'm going to read about from her. But I think it's also a beautiful description of the Christ and how the Christ heals us. And when I talk about the Christ, I don't mean the person of Jesus. I mean the spiritual idea behind his powerful healing and teaching ministries. Because all who have ever lived and walked on this planet, we see the nature of this Christ most vividly expressed in the words and the works of Jesus, which is why he has the name Christ Jesus, or Jesus the Christ. But Christ itself, as that spiritual idea that heals, that is as present in this digital age as it was 2,000 years ago or so, when we saw the amazing events surrounding the mission of Jesus. Well, the Bible itself says Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. Simple, right? But what does that actually mean? Because is Jesus, the man, still with us? No. The Bible tells us that following his crucifixion and resurrection, the Savior ascended. That is, he disappeared to the material sense of those who had known him for those brief few years. And it's still the case, and it will forever remain the case. But what about the Christ? The Christ that he made so apparent in those brief few years. There is no coming and going of the Christ. The Christ that he so clearly expressed is with each and every one of us every moment of every day. As Mary Baker Eddy put it in a message to her church in 1900, is there more than one Christ? And hath Christ a second appearing? There is but one Christ, and from everlasting to everlasting, this Christ is never absent. Well, in the light of that, you could say that the everlasting Christ is evidenced in Eddy's discovery of Christian Science, and it's evidenced in the ongoing demonstration being made by people all around the world of the healing power of this discovery. This healing power that lifts us above whatever dark clouds we're facing, so that we can find our true nature as the radiant reflections of that infinite divine light. And that's what you see in Patricia. Patricia today is a joyous 30-something professional living in Chicago, and she has a tendency to break into mutually beneficial conversations with strangers. Whether she's at home in Chicago or traveling the world with her husband, they love to go to far-off places. So a lot of joy, a lot of wonderful goodness there. But as a high schooler, that wasn't the case. She was so tormented by sadness and by darkness within that she was shipped off to a psychiatrist who very quickly prescribed her pills to take to meet the depression, even though Patricia herself felt that there was actually something deeper within that needed to be addressed, which could never be reached by pills. She actually had no sense of God in her life at that time. It wasn't a spiritual sense in that way, but she had that inherent sense that there was something deeper that needed to be dealt with. In addition, the medicine she took turned her depression to a suicidal depression. And then it went downwards. She tried to address the problem by drinking alcohol, still in her teens, to excess, and she also developed an eating disorder that took her down to a weight of 90 pounds. She said that gave her a brief sense of taking control back, but unfortunately it also made her more sick, more unwell, more desperate. Finally, she hit rock bottom, and that was when she had what she calls a window experience, a moment of seeing a glimpse of the spiritual reality we're talking about in this talk and we'll be talking about all afternoon. When spiritual light, deep wisdom, and a real sense of peace broke through that darkness and overtook her thoughts. As I said, she had no belief of God at that time, but she had that wonderful spiritual experience. She had a new sense of life, and she felt deeply, deeply loved. And then the window shut, and the darkness came back in. And in one way, she was back where she started, except now she had a benchmark, and she knew what she wanted. She wanted to experience that spiritual love and that spiritual light again. And eventually she did. At this point, she still had that repetitive impulse to kill herself. But she met someone who turned out to be a Christian Scientist, who had a wonderful sense of peace about her, and who shared some inspiring ideas one particular afternoon, which just led Patricia to go and read a copy of Science and Health, The Key to the Scriptures, that book you saw at the beginning of the lecture. And she read it from cover to cover, hour after hour. And she said that that repetitive impulse to kill herself lost its hold on her because she lost all faith in self-destruction as a means of change. She lost all faith in self-destruction as a means of change as she read the book. And this is how she described that reading. She said, "As I read, the room seemed to be filled with a pure light. I was held in that secret place of the Most High that the Bible talks about. I felt as if I was being spoken to directly in my heart of hearts. Everything was being washed and sifted within me, and so much was being revealed. It was literally like coming home." Well, that sense of being washed and sifted refers to the Christ and how it not only redeems our present and our future, but it can also redeem the past that seems to be hanging over our heads. When we glimpse what the Christ is revealing, we see that those mistakes we seem to have made and that suffering we seem to have experienced along the way was never ever God's will for us, and it never really touched the truth of who we were and actually are. So seeing that, as Patricia did, gave her a whole new sense of her depression. And last but not least of her quotes, I love the way she articulates these things. She says, "I was being removed from the gravity of materialistic thinking into a buoyant, diviner consciousness. This was a pivotal moment for me. I realized my completeness and freedom as a child of God." And of course, she was completely freed and has been completely free from that depression ever since, as well as experiencing many other healings. Well, what about physical healing? That was a mental health healing. I also want to tell you the story of Angie. And now, Patricia actually had her healing just from reading Science and Health. I mean, she had her healing because of God's love and experiencing that God love. But the technique, if you like, was reading the book and feeling that love of God, experiencing it, and learning a different sense of herself. Sometimes we need a bit of help. And when we do need a bit of help, we might need someone like a Christian Science practitioner to be praying for us and giving us Christian Science treatment, which is a particular approach to prayer that addresses the needs of others through mental means, spiritual means. So Angie actually had a diagnosis of mycoplasma pneumonia. And she had that diagnosis in a hospital, not because she wanted to be in a hospital, but some relatives of hers were really concerned about her and asked her to get a checkup. And she felt it was a loving thing to do in that case, did it, and had a consultant who basically told her, "You shouldn't leave this hospital, you should stay in and we need to treat you right now." And he prescribed pills for her. But Angie had been using Christian Science to meet her needs for decades. And so she asked to be released and was discharged reluctantly, but the consultant was really kind and offered his private number to call him if the condition deteriorated at all. She didn't file the prescription. She went home, she got a Christian Science practitioner to pray for her, and she asked a Christian Science nurse to come to her home and help look after her. Christian Science nurse is someone who's qualified to give practical aid in the sick room, but also brings a wonderful sense of commitment to supporting a spiritual atmosphere in that sick room and in the relationship with the patient. And with that help, Angie improved a little bit, but she jumped ahead of herself and she got out of bed rather too soon and collapsed in absolute exhaustion and needed to go back to bed, and as you can imagine, felt like doing nothing else but losing consciousness and going to sleep. But there was this little message that came to her, and it told her to reread citations she had been reading earlier in the day from the Bible and from Science and Health on God's love, on divine love specifically. She'd already read this collection of citations twice, so she was feeling rather reluctant to do so. But eventually she conceded that it was a divine message, divine guidance, and so she did. And boy, was she glad she did. She got to this place in the book of Isaiah where she read, "Fear thou not, for I am with thee." And she was full of fear. But as she read that, and you can imagine why she would be full of fear, because that's what she was experiencing, that pneumonia. But she immediately felt the fear draining away, dissolving, as she read that quote. And then she went on to read a quote from Science and Health. "The depth, breadth, height, might, majesty, and glory of infinite love fill all space. That is enough." Now, I don't know about you, but those words, even on the page in black and white or in whatever those colors are, look beautiful. They resonate. But when the science of those words, the truth of those words, becomes real in your consciousness and in your experience, they are exalting, powerful, and healing. And that's what happened for Angie. She had a wonderful moment which she describes as, I felt completely surrounded by God's love. And in that holy moment, Angie was completely healed. Every single symptom of the pneumonia completely disappeared. Now, once again, at her family's request, she went to the hospital to have a checkup. They were still concerned. And studying the x-rays, this is what the doctor told Angie. The lungs are completely clear. There is no trace nor any indication of the symptoms you'd had of pneumonia. Now, both Angie's story and Patricia's evidence the power of spiritual understanding to actually be the medicine that removes physical or mental illness, independent of any drugs or surgery or other alternative medicines. And such healings are not in and of themselves, wonderful as they are, the overarching goal of Christian Science. They point to and prove to this underlying reality of who we truly are as God sees us, not bounded by matter's limitations, but reflecting the boundless goodness of divine spirit, God. They challenge the substantiality of everything that seems so real to our eyes and our ears and all our material senses, to that distorted sense of reality, that misapprehension of existence, as Mrs. Eddy calls it, which seems so real, but is not the reality that we're going to talk about right now. So I do want to make it clear, though, that I'm not saying that the good in our lives that we see and hear isn't real, because the good in our lives is very real, and we want to appreciate it. The love, the creativity, the industriousness, those kind of qualities, they are real. They are attributes that indeed evidence the reality of our divine source, God. So let's cherish the good that we see in life as expressions of the divine, whether it's a mother's love, the beauty of a landscape like the scene that I can see out there, or whether it's the creativity that's applied in art or in industry. Everything is as real as the spiritual idea that is perceived through it. Everything is as real as the spiritual idea that is being perceived through it. But that material framework, that mortal sense of substance, the belief in an intelligence that can be separate from love, those are the mistaken perceptions of the higher reality. The higher reality is all good, all the time, for everybody. So instead, we can recognize that there are not two creations, there is one, that spiritual reality. And then we can discern and demonstrate this pure environment of spirit, which Paul described by saying that we live and move and have our being in it. And when we perceive that through prayer, that's what brings healing into our human experience. But nevertheless, I think it's important also to recognize that the truth isn't just there in order to heal us. It's there because it is the truth. And it's actually more that the healing is there to prove that the truth is true to us. That we are actually the man and woman of God's creating, made in God's image and likeness and sustained as God's image and likeness. And a wonderful, powerful stepping stone to realizing that is the quality of humility. And Mrs. Eddy's demonstration of humility was, we said this earlier, remember this? You remember what we were talking earlier, reflecting divine love when she got Mary out of the way? Well, right after that, she says this: when I would reach this tone, and I would think of it as a tone of thought, the sick would be healed without a word. When she reached that humility of knowing that she wasn't the accomplisher, but by getting Mary out of the way, love would be reflected, that's what would happen. And an extraordinary record of healings that you can read up about that Mary Baker Eddy has left behind. And that just prove what she was saying there. Many, many instantaneous healings. And she once shared a wonderful snapshot of what the healing consciousness actually looks like. She was speaking to a student of hers called Abigail Dyer Thompson, and she said, "I saw the love of God encircling the universe and man, filling all space. And that divine love so permeated my own consciousness that I loved with Christ-like compassion everything I saw." And again, that looks beautiful on the page. And she felt that, she experienced that. But it wasn't an abstract spiritual bliss. It was downright practical. She said, this realization of divine love called into expression the beauty of holiness, the perfection of being, which healed and regenerated and saved all who turned to me for help. That is how practical that spiritual consciousness was and is. Now each of us, step by step, can gain more of this pure spiritual consciousness. When we look at that, we might feel, well, I'm in kindergarten compared to that clarity and demonstration, but everybody starts somewhere, and wherever we are, we can make wonderful progress. Do you remember that piano? Not everyone can compose music like Beethoven, but every one of us can learn to see beyond a box with black and white keys and appreciate the potential inherent in every piano we see. Each and every one of us can see beyond the black and white print on the pages of the Bible to that gift of the Comforter, to the practical, healing, divine science that is inherent in the pages of any Bible anywhere around the world that you open. Spirituality has to be practical, and it's wonderful that it is practical. A contemporary of Mrs. Eddy's called Philip Brooks, who was the Episcopal minister who wrote that wonderful hymn, O Little Town of Bethlehem, also felt this need to make spiritual living practical. He said, I'll read it to you. He said, God has not given us vast learning to solve all the problems or unfailing wisdom to direct all the wanderings of our brothers' lives, but he has given to every one of us the power to be spiritual, and by our spirituality to lift and enlarge and enlighten the lives that we touch. So this is something we can each do right where we are now, every day. But there's something more to this particular quote. When Mary Baker Eddy was given a copy of this quote to read, she scribbled next to it, "The secret of my life is in the above." The secret of my life is in the above. Now, in hindsight, this is something of an open secret. It was laid bare by a spiritual discovery written in a book called Science and Health with Keys of Scriptures that the National Women's Book Association in America here described as having changed the world. Well, the science of the Christ articulated in Science and Health has changed the world, and it has changed the world for the better, and it must and will continue to do so. Why? Because after 150 years of healing, Mary Baker Eddy's discovery of divine science, that practical, prayerful spirituality of the Comforter, is still only in the early days of its mission to heal and free all humanity. Thank you.